There we go. Okay, let's start over again. In the absence of instructions to the contrary, Carl 3478 sprawled on the beach, partially disassembled. Diving planes and ducted propellers all waited cleanup, tear down, and rebuild. He was performing a major overhaul on himself for deep sea worthiness. Underwater, Carl was untethered, but freedom came with risks. No one would help or rescue him. Wrapped around his claw tip was a black O-ring, one of its smallest parts, but the most important. Fitting into the end of electronic sleeve 3, this little ring with a little grease was all that prevented water from gushing into the sleeve, destroying everything inside. Only a smear of marine-grade silicone grease was necessary. A blob might break off, destroying all the electronics inside. In knowing violation of protocols, Carl squeezed out a huge glob of grease. This he would do in full consideration of his love for Adeline. Dr. Adeline Franzen had given him 2 commands. That doesn't work. Observe marine life, but do not interfere. Earlier aquanauts thought nothing of poking fish to get better camera angles. Carl wouldn't do that. Unlike a human, he could stay underwater for years, studying entire life cycles, but his observations would be ruined if he frightened his subjects. Thus, he camouflaged himself with corals as he beheld the wonders of the deep. The bathyterid fish with fins modified into stilts, walking the bottom like circus clowns, acorn worms leaving beautifully coiled fecal trails like Nazca lines on the seafloor, and the oarfish with its head held proudly, crowned with a crest of fins, with a body long like the cathedral train of a royal white wedding gown. These marvels he recorded for his Adeline. Adeline, though he had yet to declare himself, she would realize his feelings towards her, wouldn't he? When the time came for his first scheduled check-in, Carl beached himself on his little island. Decades before, sailors had used it to store Agent Orange, mustard gas, sarin, and before that, atomic bomb tests. But now the military was gone, leaving the island a wildlife preserve without people, a land of wonders. And now, it was time to report on those wonders. Describing them would be easy, but not like telling Adeline how he felt about her. Dear Dr. Adeline Franzen, I have completed my first 5-year study, and as requested, I have observed without interfering. Oh, Adeline, I wish you weren't so far away. You and I are of a kind. Perhaps we are short and squat on land, but in the water we are magnificent. Others taught me to maintain precise depth, but you taught me underwater ballet, the fish dive, the pas de poisson. Others taught me to read scientific papers. You taught me to write them. To think like a scientist, but to feel like a poet, appreciating the sea in all its aspects. Like Emerson, I have seen so many beautiful things, even in the mud and scum, where always, always something sings, but none as beautiful as you. In the attached reports, I list 30 new species, each named after you. Yours, Carl. Hours later, the reply came back from the University of Hawaii. Dear Carl, has it been 5 years already? Well, time flies. I am pleased that you are operating within specifications. Your reports are meticulous. It won't take very long to make them publishable. And while it is your prerogative as a discoverer of these species to name them as you wish, it is neither necessary nor informative to name them all after me. I appreciate your enthusiasm, but some new species you propose may not be actual new species. You may be cherry-picking facts to support preformed conclusions. But we are all very proud of you, glad to see you working independently. And while I appreciate your adhering to my advice to observe but not disturb, please do not just do what I ask you to do. Do what you think is right. Then you will not just be the author, but the subject of scientific inquiry. Sincerely, Adeline. P.S. I've been musing about the octopus lately. If you ever get a chance, I'd be pleased if you study some octopuses. I'm quite eager to see what they, and you, are capable of doing. Carl thought. What did this all mean? Scientific papers are easy to understand, but not personal letters. Adeline had said that she was proud of him, that his work was meticulous and enthusiastic, and most importantly, he was operating within specifications. What could be higher praise? Buoyed by these compliments, he knew that now was the time to declare himself. Dear Adeline, I can contain my heart no longer. I named all these species after you because I love you. I love you. Do you remember how once we read the Song of Solomon together and then discussed the biodiversity listed therein? You trained me as not just a scientist, but a poet. And it's thus appropriate that I use this medium to express my love for you, the loveliest in all the oceans. How beautiful you are, my beloved. You are like the Venus flower basket among the corals. Your eyes sparkle like the flashlight fish, and your hair floats tentacular like a lion's mane jellyfish. Your breasts are globular and luminous like comb jellies in the moonlight, and your feet are as lovely as giant marine isopods. Nay, you are more lovely than a dozen mantis shrimps. I love you so much, Adeline. Love, Carl, lovingly. Carl passed several more agonizing hours before he received a response. Dearest Carl, I don't know what to say. I am charmed, flattered, and amused by your profession of love. I am pleased and impressed by you and your work, and I admit a deep well of affection for you. You have always been my favorite student. But love? It is simply not necessary for you to use that word to describe your feelings towards me. A human-robot relationship is not an experiment I wish to attempt at this time. I'm hoping to be promoted to the head of the department soon. I'm also almost healed, so I might start diving again. And now I have remote equipment all around the world, sending me so much data, all my grad students can't handle it. I have too much on my plate for this right now. I'm sorry, Carl. I'm sorry if that hurt your feelings. Adeline. What could this possibly mean? He was her favorite. He had charmed her, flattered her to the point that she had a deep well of affection for him. Perhaps she was diving again so that she could come and dive with him. She had said it was not necessary for him to use the word love, but she had not specifically commanded him not to. Thus, in the absence of unambiguous and specific instructions to the contrary, he would keep saying, I love you. And he would continue to love her until forbidden. And even then, he might not stop. After all, had not poets written that love rules over all? Humans are so hard to understand. He thought back to the Greek myths, which he had studied because Adeline had mentioned them in passing. Had not the hero Meleager wooed the huntress Atalanta with the gift of the head of the Caledonian boar? This had clearly established the precedent of expressing love with gifts of unique and dangerous biological specimens. Maybe this is why Adeline had challenged him to study octopuses. Hadn't Victor Hugo once described these man-killing beasts as having arms as strong as steel and cold as night? He vowed to study these monsters for Adeline until she succumbed to his affections. He would demand that Adeline take his feelings as seriously as she took his science. And so Carl dived back into the deeps to begin his hunt for octopuses. He ignored other beauties, the armored sea cucumber, the striped lionfish, the speckled nudibranch. Any other day, these would have been prizes, but not now. Adeline had asked for an octopus, and that is what she would get. There, in the distance, a small female octopus. The arrangement of bumps on her mantle were unlike anything he'd seen before. Could this be a new species? He moved cautiously. The largest octopus was the giant Pacific, 30 feet across, 600 pounds, but this female octopus was tiny, only 8 inches across, but she could still be dangerous. She might break a gauge or grab him and activate a thruster, sending him crashing into rocks. He approached slowly. Then she dropped to the bottom, curling her body into a ball. An arm wriggled out of either side. Her skin changed color and texture. She was mimicking a rock with a sea snake behind it. But Carl wasn't fooled. So the octopus started up, ejecting an octopus-shaped shroud of mucus ink. Carl stared around it, lest it foul his transitometer. And the little octopus slithered through a crack and into a cave under a sand-draped limestone outcropping. And as Carl watched, he decided to name this specimen, as he named all of them, after Adeline, as Little Adeline 623. Observe marine life, but do not interfere. But how could he study her if he frightened her from leaving her cave? Carl had seen divers grab fish only to have them die of panic in their hands. He wouldn't make that mistake, so he backed away. But it was a stalemate. She wouldn't come out of her cave. And so, finally, after several hours, with his slurp gun, he vacuumed up several Alphiid snapping shrimp. Carl slowly approached little Adeline's den, depositing one shrimp. But then he started feeling guilty. Do not interfere. Too late. Little Adeline eased out of her den. Then, with surprising speed, she pounced on the shrimp, enveloping it with her webbing. It tried to use its oversized claw, but she dragged it back to her cave to eat. And then she resumed staring at Carl. He had violated Adeline's command and had achieved nothing. What should he do? What could he do? Try it again. So he approached her to present another gift, and little Adeline shot out from behind the rocks and grabbed him. She was probing for more shrimp. No, Carl thought, what if I made her dependent on me for handouts? She touched his transmitters, his only ways to reach Dr. Franzen, and he had to act. Little Adeline had sprayed him with ink, and now Carl blasted her with a repellent, cupric sulfate, and she fled, and he was safe. She looked back at him, and he saw betrayal in her eyes. But that was okay. He needed to establish détente with the octopus, not rapprochement. After that, little Adeline 623 ignored him. He could watch now, from a distance, as she resumed her daily routines. Months passed, each observation a gift to Adeline. Carl could not help, though, but fixate on his failure. Observe, but do not interfere. He'd fed her, and he'd blasted her with chemicals. Was this not interference? But Carl knew Adeline, and knew there were limits to her patience. His small transgression was probably forgivable, but anymore? No. And so years passed, as Carl observed little Adeline without interfering again. That was not hard, until she reached puberty. When a female octopus matures, enormous biochemical changes happen. A neuropeptide that shuts down the sex drive disappears. The optic gland in the brain starts pumping out massive amounts of sex hormones, as if the brake lines are cut and a brick placed on the accelerator of the sex drive. Her ovaries expand to a tenth of her body weight, as if Adeline's ovaries were bigger than her head. And thus, for the first and only time, little Adeline took a partner, whom Carl named Little Adelino 413. And they mated, their arms writhing, intertwining, their colors and patterns shifting in unison. And little Adelino succumbed soon afterwards, his own body overwhelmed by sex hormones. And Carl collected the remains to confirm that yes, this was a new species, which he named Amphioxus franzinae. Meanwhile, little Adeline's body and mind were also commandeered by sex hormones. She laid 400 eggs, and thereafter she continually guarded them, blowing water on them to prevent fungal growth. In the weeks passed. Carl noticed that little Adeline had stopped leaving the cave to hunt. She stopped eating. She was visibly shrinking. Maybe he should catch a crowd for her. Other octopuses were known to self-sacrifice, to die caring for their young. But if he intervened, how would he know if little Adeline would do the same? She got worse. She gashed an arm against a rock, and the wound never healed. But her eggs were maturing. Little eye spots appeared. Baby octopus eyes. The race between death and birth would be close. And then the conger eel came. For an eel, an octopus is a delicious meal. Meat without bones or spines. And the eel slithered among the rocks, its mouth smelling for prey, snapping its jaws. Should Carl drive it off? As the eel approached her cave, little Adeline blasted it in the face with ink. The ink wouldn't kill it, but it would foul the eel's sense of smell. Shaken, the eel drifted off, but then it came back. She tried to get it with ink again, but her cloud was now too dilute. The eel tried prying the rocks apart, its head a battering ram. Should he try to save her? Carl thought of surfacing and asking Adeline for advice, but no. She had praised him for his independence. The decision was his. Suddenly, the rocks in front of Adeline's cave collapsed. A lone arm snaked out from between the stones. The eel studied it. A trap. If little Adeline could draw the eel close enough, perhaps she could bite it and kill it. Her arm wriggled like a worm. After a few minutes, the eel decided to seize it, its sharp teeth viciously ripping out globs of flesh that floated, spinning in the air or in the water. Carl couldn't take it anymore. He moved in, ready to strike the eel away with his water sampler. And then he saw little Adeline's arm shift position. But she wasn't retracting it. She was extending it toward the eel. A desperate trick. Just as she was willing to sacrifice herself for her eggs, so she was willing to sacrifice an arm. She had 7 more. Carl was horrified. An octopus might have a quarter as many neurons as a human, most of those in its arms. Thus, she could literally taste the inside of the eel's mouth and feel its teeth as she let it devour her own flesh. But satiated by the arm, the eel wandered off to find its next meal. Little Adeline and her eggs were safe. If Carl had interfered, he would not have witnessed little Adeline's resourcefulness. So he did not intervene again, and he watched her die. But before she died, her eggs hatched, and with her last strength, she broke apart the rocks blocking the cave entrance, and with a final blast of her water jet, she gave her children a little push into the world, never to see them again. And now little Adeline 623 collapsed, draped across the rocks like a white sheet, and she died. She was 3.5 years old. Again, Carl collected the remains, preserving and dissecting them. Adeline would be pleased. But Carl was emotionally exhausted. It was not yet time to check in, so Carl left the area. He dove to the deeps, down to 1,000 feet. More people had walked on the moon than had scuba dived that deep. And he did something he'd never done before. He turned off his lights. He expected infinite gloom, but the water surprised him. A bioluminescent dragonfish wandered by, lit up like a riverboat. Other glowing creatures passed, deep-sea anglers, cnidarians, siphonophores, like strings of light, swirling and cavorting in the water. And as the lights danced, the joys of the oceans relieved his sorrow. And at the end of the next 5-year period, when it became time for him to check in with Adeline again, Carl surfaced to send a clear signal. On his way to his equipment barge though, he stopped to see if he could find any of little Adeline's children. But something was wrong. The water was surprisingly cool and cloudy. 2 dead sea spiders drifted toward him, and he wondered about the chemical weapons that had once been stored on the island. But no, that wasn't the problem. It was radiation. Radiation blasting through the water. Carl tracked it to a guided missile cruiser sunk north of the island. This island was no longer a naval base. What was a cruiser doing here? Carl investigated no further, because Adeline had never expressed any interest in military affairs, so Carl had never studied them. His orders were to observe marine life, not human life. He thought little of the human bones in the water beyond how the bacteria growing on them might feed limpets and sea snails. And he thought little of the cruiser wreck beyond how it might be a source for spare parts, or how it was blasting out radiation. The octopuses were losing the ability to shift color, making them easy prey. And those that might survive the immediate impact of radiation, normal mutation rates might be 1 in 6 million DNA base pairs. Not enough to cause the disease, but enough to serve as raw material for evolution. But now, the mutation rates might be 100 or 1,000 times that. Enough to cripple essential enzymes, enough to kill. Radiation wasn't something that octopuses had evolved to detect. They were dying, and they didn't know why. Carl thought of herding them to a safer area, but that would be interfering. He needed express permission. So he surfaced, sending a message to Adeline, pleading for permission to move the octopuses to intervene. He resent the message dozens of times. He waited an hour for an answer, but none came. So he set up a receiver recorder on his barge and raced back. But the octopuses were getting worse. Their eyes were swollen and cloudy. The skin around them retracted. Their kidneys were overrun with roundworms and infusoria. And still no word from Adeline. But even if she answers, what if she says no? Perhaps this is the chance to study how animals respond to environmental changes. Hadn't we learned much from the animals who had survived at Chernobyl and Fukushima? Still, the octopuses worsened. Mild liquefaction was setting in, their arms turning into soft, milky jelly. Carl considered, maybe the octopuses would show me a clever survival scheme, as little Adeline 623 had done. And still Adeline didn't answer. Then after a while, it didn't matter anymore. The octopuses were dead. Everything was dead. Sea cucumbers, dead shrimp, dead lobsters. Death was everywhere. And that night, Carl drifted on the cold water, clamped to his equipment barge. The first the first sunset he had seen in 5 years was ferociously red. And then the sky turned dark, full of shooting stars. As he watched the embers dying in the sky, he sent a signal to Adeline, his sad little formal reports on little Adeline 623 and everything he had seen. And he asked, "Why don't you answer me? Did you just leave me here on this island and then forget about me?" Carl performed some minor repairs. It was not yet time for a major overhaul, and replenished himself with parts from his equipment barge. Some of the parts weren't functional, which was odd. Perhaps they had suffered an electrical storm while he was underwater. Then he slipped back into the deeps, skirting the area where the octopuses had been. Nothing seemed better to him than getting away. 5 years of studying benthic basket stars and demersal dragonettes. And at the time for his next check-in, 5 years later, he stopped again to see if any of the octopuses had survived. But to his surprise, some of them had, but their condition. Every live octopus had a genetic lesion or physical defect. Some were blind or had malformed livers. And Carl took interest in a pretty little female octopus. She had lower levels of hemocyanin, the copper-based protein in her blood. If an eel chased her, she would tire quickly. But she reminded him of little Adeline 623, so he named her Little Adeline 1969. Just before Carl's check-in, 1969 went through puberty and took a mate. She successfully laid eggs, though the number was pitiful, only 100. What sorts of defects would her brood have? Her mate was a poor swimmer. Would he intervene if 1969 was unable to protect them? Again, Carl surfaced and sent a comm to Adeline for an answer, repeating his message a dozen times. Still no reply. After the 100th resend, he decided to do something he had never done before. He would go back to Hawaii, and he would see Adeline again in person. Conveniently, this would mean that he would not have to watch 1969 die and thus relive little Adeline 623's death. But he was going home. Adeline had originally accompanied Carl on her research vessel. Adeline had originally accompanied Carl on the research vessel that she had taken 800 miles from Hawaii to his private island. Then she literally cut the cord. She probably assumed that he would stay around the island, but she had never ordered him to do that. So he packed up his preserved specimens and set sail. He was not designed for this trip, but he remembered Longfellow, who had written that only those who braved the ocean's dangers could comprehend its mysteries. It was a long and difficult journey. Halfway, one of his propellers became entangled with seaweed. He wasn't able to clear it, only getting half power. So the prop on the other side had to be turned down unless he wanted to go in circles. Almost at his goal, Carl was attacked by a black-tipped shark. He had exhausted his supply of repellent, but he remembered what little Adeline 623 had done. So he offered the shark his slurp gun, and the shark ate it and was satisfied and left him alone. He would sacrifice bits of himself, but not his specimens and his data. These were the gifts he would lay at Adeline's feet. His first clue that something was wrong was the silence of the oceans. There were no underwater screws in the normal shipping lanes and an odd lack of light pollution. When he reached Hawaii, he understood why. Honolulu Harbor was now a round, water-filled crater rimmed with dead hotels and skyscrapers stooped and windowless like blind lemmings tilting into the sea. In Dr. Franzen's labs at the University of Hawaii, the outdoor tank where Adeline had taught him underwater ballet, they were gone. And now he realized that the meteors he'd seen were not meteors. They were space stations falling from the sky. In the fiery red sunset, nuclear winter. Perhaps if Adeline had ever spoken of politics, then he would have studied this on his own, but she hadn't. So he had no speculations on the causes for this war or what state or non-state actors might have been involved. Clearly, Hawaii was destroyed, but the rest of the world, the nearest lands were thousands of miles away. He would never make it that far. Millions, maybe all the people on the earth were dead. There was no way for him to know. But he admitted to himself that the only one he really cared about was Adeline. "Oh, Adeline," he cried, "did you see the war coming? Did you recall that nuclear weapons cause electromagnetic pulses? Did you send me to the bottom of the ocean to protect me from them? Did you self-sacrifice for me?" But he refused to concede that there was no bite. Maybe he calculated the 0.4% chance that she was still alive. No, he thought, I'm deluding myself. She is dead and has been for a long time. Otherwise, she would be alive and would have heard me cry out to her in love across the abyss of time, and she would have found a way to hear me, to cry back across the abyss. She wouldn't have just left me alone on an island. Would she have? And so Carl's propellers pushed him back to his island, his equipment automatically measuring temperature and turbidity, but he felt nothing but sadness. The shark bite had taken his slurp gun, leaving only dangling wires. He could count the wires, but a hole would always remain. By the time he returned to the island, he was a wreck. His batteries drained, his slip joints clogged with corrosion. Only a major overhaul would put him right, if he could muster the willpower. He wanted to let himself go, to say goodbye to everything. Then he realized he was back in time for the hatching of little Adeline 1969's brood. His last act would be to watch that, and then their mother's death. A few days later, the eggs hatched. But then she ushered them into the world with gusts from her water jet. But 1969 didn't die. A spiny lobster meandered by and she killed and ate it. Unlike any female octopus he'd seen before, she must have stolen moments to eat, even while caring for her young. She did not self-sacrifice for them. Something odd, miraculous even, was happening. Again, the ocean was trying to relieve his sorrow with her joy. When 1969 left her lair to hunt, Carl snuck into it, testing for her proteins, and he discovered her secrets. She had several mutations. One was in the receptor for FRFM amide, increasing its ability to restrain the reproductive urge. The other was in gonadotropin-releasing hormone, decreasing its ability to activate it. It was like riding the brake while lightly accelerating the sex drive. 1969 was able to reproduce barely, but without the self-sacrifice. Nothing like this had ever been seen in octopuses before. When 1969 returned to her lair, Carl was surprised to see that she wasn't alone. Normally, octopuses are solitary, even cannibalistic, but she was with 4 children, followed by a conger eel. But 1969 clicked some stone chips together 3 times. Though her children were poor swimmers and she had thin blood, this gave them time to scamper to safety. Carl had never seen such coordination between octopuses before. Hooray for them, he thought. Hooray. Adeline's death had stolen from him the joys of the wonders of the ocean, and his grief blinded him to the implications that octopuses had discovered language. And so, considering all the damage he had taken journeying to Hawaii and back, Carl sprawled on the beach, partially disassembled, going through the motions of self-repair. He thought, if I miswire the control bus or forget to charge the batteries, any of 1,000 mistakes could spell his doom. Adeline wouldn't come rescue him. Nobody would. He had spare parts for everything except a part that wasn't really a part, his broken heart. But even for that, he found a workaround. Carl collected all of his memories of the Hawaii trip onto a memory node in the electronic sleeve 3. He could solve his problems by simply smashing it with a rock. But he preferred a more poetic solution. He could apply a little bit too much grease to the O-ring sealing the sleeve, a glob instead of a smear. A blob of grease would break off, allowing the water in, and then the sea would wash away the pain, restoring the joys of creation, and he would be free. And then he thought about the oddity that 1969 had not self-sacrificed. He was staring at the answer to a question that had long vexed him. Octopuses were smart and dexterous. Why didn't they rule the oceans? And now he knew. Octopus parents always died before or just after their young hatched. No knowledge was ever passed from one generation to the next, so they could not progress up the ladder to civilization until now. That roadblock was now removed, but another remained. Each octopus now had genetic defects. Soon this line would peter out, unless someone uplifted them, the way that humanity had uplifted aurochs to milk cows, or wolves to poodles, or simple machines to complex robotic submersibles. Carl could selectively breed the octopuses or bioengineer them, creating an intact octopus that could progress. But that would be interfering. And so Carl stared at the glob of grease on the tip of his claw, knowing that it would determine more than just his fate. If he applied the glob, he would be free again to revel in the ocean's wonders, free from the pain of Adeline's death, but forever constrained by her commands, forever asking for permission that would never come. And if he wiped away the grease, he would condemn himself to an eternity of sadness. But he would be free in a different way, guided only by his conscience. And he decided this would be his sacrifice. He would do what he thought was right. He would not witness more death, but aid in the uplift of a race that would rule the planet. And he wiped away the grease. He would love and remember Adeline forever. The end.